Hayden Panettiere.
Hayden Panettiere.
Hayden Panettiere.
Hayden Panettiere.
Hayden Panettiere, known for her roles on the popular TV series like Heroes, Nashville film franchises like Bring It On and Scream, has died at the age of just 36. She began her career as a child actor.
There was a time when Hayden Panettiere seemed almost impossible to break. She was the little girl who grew up in front of America, the actress who became a household name through Heroes, and later the Nashville star whose voice, beauty, and emotional performances made millions believe they knew her. But behind the cameras, behind the red carpets, and behind the characters who seemed so fearless, Hayden was carrying a pain that she spent years trying to explain. And only months before her death at the age of 36, she finally began telling the story in her own words. What she revealed was not simply a story about fame. It was a story about a young woman who learned how to perform happiness long before she understood how to find it. Hayden Panettiere's career began when she was still a child. She entered the entertainment industry extraordinarily young, appearing in commercials and television before becoming recognizable to audiences across the country. To the public, childhood stardom looked like a dream. There were cameras, costumes, premieres, applause, and opportunities most children could never imagine. But Hayden later reflected on something darker about growing up that way. She had learned how to produce emotion on command. Crying became part of her professional skill. Adults around her recognized that she could reach emotional places other young performers struggled to reach, and the ability that helped build her career also became something she would later question. As she grew older, she began to wonder what constant access to pain was doing to her. Then came Heroes, and everything changed. Hayden became Claire Bennett, the seemingly ordinary teenager with the extraordinary ability to heal. Millions watched her character survive impossible injuries, fight terrifying threats, and somehow keep moving forward. The irony would become painful years later. On television, Claire could heal from almost anything. In real life, Hayden discovered that some wounds do not disappear simply because the cameras stop rolling. Her success continued, but so did the pressure. She was growing up while the world watched, judged, photographed, and commented on her appearance, relationships, career, and personal life. Then came Nashville. Hayden was cast as Juliet Barnes, a country music superstar whose life slowly began to unravel through addiction, relationships, motherhood, depression, and self-destruction. At first, it seemed like another acting challenge, but something about the character became increasingly uncomfortable. The storylines being written for Juliet began resembling struggles Hayden was experiencing herself. She later explained that the overlap became so intense that she could no longer clearly separate the character from the woman playing her. The actress was portraying pain while privately trying to survive her own. And then motherhood changed everything again. In 2014, Hayden gave birth to her daughter, Kaya, after a traumatic delivery that she later described as a moment when she feared she might die. Instead of experiencing motherhood as the uncomplicated happiness people expected, she found herself facing postpartum depression and emotional struggles she did not understand. She later said she did not have the resources or knowledge to recognize what was happening to her. So she searched for relief wherever she could find it. That search would eventually become one of the darkest chapters of her life. Hayden began struggling with alcohol and substance use, and the consequences reached far beyond her career. In 2018, she made the painful decision to relinquish custody of Kaya to her daughter's father, Vladimir Klitschko, while she focused on getting help. To people looking from the outside, the decision could easily be misunderstood. But Hayden later insisted that it was not abandonment. It was a mother recognizing that she was not in a condition to give her child the stability she deserved. And that decision would remain one of the deepest sources of pain in her life. Years later, Hayden would speak publicly about addiction, recovery, motherhood, trauma, and the things she wished people had understood about her. In her memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning, she opened doors that had remained closed for years. She talked about childhood fame, her struggles with alcohol and opioids, postpartum depression, painful relationships, family conflict, and the devastating loss of her younger brother Jansen in 2023. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part was that Hayden was not telling this story from a place of surrender. She was trying to tell people that she was still fighting. She described herself as a work in progress. She wanted to evolve. She wanted to change. She wanted people to understand that recovery was not a straight line and that surviving something did not mean the scars simply vanished. In interviews released only months before her death, she spoke openly about the life she had lived and the daughter she loved. She became emotional when discussing Kaya and expressed how much it meant to her, that her daughter was proud of her. And that is what makes what happened next so difficult to comprehend. Because Hayden had finally begun telling the world who she really was. She had spent years being defined by characters, headlines, rumors, addiction, relationships, and mistakes. Now, for perhaps the first time, she was attempting to define herself. But the story was not finished. Not even close. For years, Hayden Panettiere's public life seemed to be moving in the opposite direction from what was happening inside her. Her career was still alive. Her face was still recognizable. And when Nashville premiered in 2012, she stepped into one of the most important roles of her career as Juliet Barnes, a young country singer whose glamorous life was slowly consumed by addiction, heartbreak, trauma, and self-destruction. Viewers watched Hayden perform those emotions with astonishing realism. But the unsettling truth was that some of those emotions were becoming less like acting and more like something she already understood personally. The role demanded that Hayden spend hours surrounded by music, cameras, producers, and emotionally exhausting scenes. On the surface, it was another opportunity to prove herself. Yet behind the scenes, her personal life was becoming increasingly complicated. She was no longer the child actress America had watched grow up. She was a woman dealing with motherhood, relationships, enormous expectations, and a private battle that she could not simply switch off when the director yelled cut. Her struggle with alcohol and opioids would eventually become public, but the journey toward that point had begun long before most people realized anything was wrong. One of the most painful chapters came after the birth of her daughter, Kaya, in 2014. Hayden had spent years building a career, and now she had something she loved more than any role. But instead of feeling only joy, she experienced postpartum depression. She eventually became one of the public figures willing to speak openly about it, explaining that postpartum depression was real, frightening, and something women needed to be able to discuss without shame. Her decision to speak publicly was courageous, but it also came with consequences. Years later, she would say that her openness about postpartum depression affected her relationship with a major brand that had once been closely associated with her image. Then the private struggle became impossible to contain. Hayden's substance use worsened, and eventually she entered treatment. In later interviews, she described moments when alcohol and opioids had taken control of her life. She had been prescribed pain medication after injuries and surgeries, and she later revealed that her relationship with pills eventually became something far more dangerous. What began as something that appeared manageable gradually became a dependency she could not simply overcome through willpower. And then came the decision that would haunt her for years. In 2018, Hayden relinquished full custody of Kaya to Vladimir Klitschko while she focused on her recovery. To outsiders, the decision could look like a mother giving up her child. But Hayden described it very differently. She later explained that she believed Kaya deserved stability, while Hayden fought to become healthy again. It was not a painless decision. It was one of the most heartbreaking choices of her life. She continued to love her daughter deeply, but loving someone and being capable of caring for them were not always the same thing. That distinction would become central to Hayden's story. Because while the public saw photographs, headlines, and rumors, Hayden was living with the consequences of choices she later wished she could change. She also found herself facing another devastating reality. Recovery did not erase trauma. Even when the substances were no longer controlling every moment of her life, the memories, relationships, losses, and emotional wounds remained. Her relationship with Brian Hickerson became another deeply troubling chapter. The two became involved after Hayden's relationship with Klitschko ended, and Hickerson was later convicted in connection with an assault involving Hayden. She eventually spoke publicly about the relationship, and said she wanted to use her experience to help others recognize abusive situations and seek help. Her story became a painful example of how complicated relationships can become when love, fear, dependency, and vulnerability collide. Yet Hayden continued trying to rebuild. She returned to acting. She returned to interviews. She began talking more openly about her past. And, perhaps most importantly, she began trying to reclaim her own narrative. For years, other people had been telling Hayden's story for her. Tabloids discussed her relationships. Fans debated her appearance. Headlines focused on addiction. Photographers followed her private life. But now Hayden was attempting to tell the story herself. Her memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning, became the clearest expression of that decision. Released only months before her death, the book confronted some of the most painful experiences of her life, including addiction, motherhood, trauma, family conflict, and the death of her younger brother Jansen. Rather than pretending everything had been resolved, Hayden described a life still marked by recovery and unfinished healing. And strangely enough, one of the places where Hayden had once felt safest was the set of Heroes. She later described the structure of that work as a kind of saving grace during periods when her addiction was becoming more difficult to control. When she was working, she had somewhere to be and something demanding her attention. The schedule gave her purpose. But when the cameras stopped rolling and she returned to her private life, the problems waiting for her had not disappeared. That contrast may explain so much about Hayden's life. She could perform strength even while feeling fragile. She could portray characters who survived impossible circumstances while privately wondering whether she could survive her own. She could walk onto a red carpet looking confident while carrying pain that nobody standing behind the camera could see. And by 2026, something had changed. Hayden was no longer hiding behind the idea that everything was fine. She was speaking openly about the past. She was talking about her daughter. She was discussing recovery. She was reflecting on the people who had helped her and the people she believed had hurt her. In interviews shortly before her death, she spoke with an emotional honesty that made her final public appearances feel very different when viewed in retrospect. But nobody watching those interviews could have known how little time remained. Hayden Panettiere died on August 16, 2026, at the age of 36, after she was found unresponsive and in cardiac arrest at a residence in Greenville, South Carolina. Emergency responders attempted to revive her, but those efforts were unsuccessful. At the time of this chapter, officials had not established an official cause or manner of death, and further investigation and testing remained pending. That uncertainty matters, because in the days following her death, speculation began spreading rapidly across the internet. But Hayden's representative has urged people not to turn rumors into conclusions, emphasizing that there is more to the story than what is publicly known. And that brings us to the darkest part of Hayden's story. Because the woman the world thought it understood was still fighting battles almost nobody could fully see. And somewhere inside those final months was a story that Hayden had been trying to tell us all along. For Hayden Panettiere, the hardest part of rebuilding her life may have been that the world never stopped looking backward. Even after she entered recovery, returned to acting, and began speaking openly about what she had survived, the headlines often reduced her to the worst moments of her life. Addiction became part of her public identity. Her relationship with Brian Hickerson became another recurring headline. And her decision to place her daughter Kaya in her father's care was repeatedly discussed, as though it were a simple choice instead of one of the most painful decisions Hayden had ever made. But Hayden herself was trying to tell a different story. She was trying to explain that recovery was not a dramatic moment where everything suddenly became perfect. It was a process filled with setbacks, difficult memories, and moments when simply getting through the day could be an achievement. In her memoir, This Is Me, A Reckoning, she confronted much of that history directly. She wrote about growing up in Hollywood, postpartum depression, addiction, her relationship with Hickerson, and the complicated emotions surrounding her daughter. Her willingness to revisit those experiences suggested that she was determined to take ownership of a story that had been publicly dissected for years. Then, another tragedy struck her family. In February 2023, Hayden's younger brother, Jansen Panettiere, died at only 28 years old. His death devastated Hayden. Jansen had been more than her brother. He was someone who had grown up alongside her in the same extraordinary and often overwhelming world of entertainment. Losing him added another layer of grief to a life that had already contained enormous emotional pain. In the years afterward, Hayden would continue carrying that loss while attempting to rebuild the rest of her life. And yet there were signs that she still had plans. She still talked about work. She still talked about her daughter. She still wanted to move forward. That is why her death on August 16, 2026, was so shocking. Hayden was only 36 years old, and her passing came at a time when many people believed she was finally beginning to reclaim control over her life. Emergency responders were called to the Judson Mill Lofts in Greenville, South Carolina, after Hayden was found unresponsive. She was in cardiac arrest, and first responders attempted resuscitation. She was pronounced dead at the scene. A subsequent autopsy found no visible trauma that would have contributed to her death, but the official cause and manner remained undetermined while toxicology and additional testing were underway. Then came the detail that immediately intensified public attention. Dispatch audio reportedly referenced a possible overdose, but that does not establish an official cause of death. Authorities had not announced that an overdose was responsible, and Hayden's representative later pushed back strongly against the rumors spreading online. The representative emphasized that there was much more to the story than what was currently known and urged people not to turn speculation into fact. There was another painful complication. Brian Hickerson was reportedly present when Hayden died. Their relationship had been turbulent for years, and Hickerson had previously faced domestic violence charges connected to Hayden. According to reports from the death investigation, he and his brother were at the residence when she was found unresponsive. Authorities have not accused him of causing Hayden's death, and investigators have reported no signs of foul play. Those distinctions matter because the internet quickly began constructing its own version of events before officials had reached a final conclusion. The investigation became even more serious when the Drug Enforcement Administration was reportedly brought into the case. Authorities were examining medications associated with Hayden, while toxicology testing remained pending. Reports indicated that Narcan, a medication used to reverse opioid overdoses, was found at the scene. But again, these details were pieces of an investigation, not a final explanation for why Hayden died. And perhaps that uncertainty is what makes the final chapter of Hayden's story so haunting. Because just days before her death, she had been talking about the life she wanted people to remember. She had been discussing her daughter. She had been reflecting on recovery. She had been opening up about experiences that she had spent years trying to escape. She was not presenting a perfect life. She was presenting a human one. Hayden's mother, Leslie Vogel, later spoke publicly about her daughter's struggles and the people surrounding her. She wanted Hayden remembered not simply for addiction, controversy, or tragedy, but for her intelligence, beauty, humor, and extraordinary spirit. And that may be the most important distinction of all. Hayden Panettiere was not the tragedy that happened to her. She was not only the child star who grew up too quickly. She was not only the actress who battled addiction. She was not only the mother who made an agonizing decision about custody. And she was not only the woman whose final days became the subject of an investigation. She was all of those things at once: a daughter, a sister, a mother, an actress, a survivor, a woman who made mistakes and admitted them, a woman who experienced pain and tried to turn that pain into something meaningful. And just when she had finally begun telling the story in her own voice, the world lost the chance to hear what she might have said next. But there was one final piece of Hayden's story that made her death even more heartbreaking. The person she had been trying hardest to live for, the relationship that remained at the center of her heart, and the unfinished future she still hoped to share with her daughter. Perhaps the hardest thing to understand about Hayden Panettiere's final years is that beneath all the headlines, there was still a woman who wanted the same thing most parents want: more time with her child. Hayden's daughter, Kaya, was at the center of so many of the decisions that shaped her adult life. When Hayden relinquished custody in 2018, she described the decision as heartbreaking, but she also understood that getting healthy had to come first. In the years that followed, she continued speaking about her love for Kaya and about the hope that one day her daughter would understand why those painful choices had been made. And that hope became especially emotional in the months before Hayden's death. She had begun discussing her life more honestly than ever before. Her memoir gave audiences a glimpse behind the image of a glamorous actress and into the private battles she had fought since childhood. She spoke about addiction, recovery, motherhood, trauma, abusive relationships, and loss. But there was something different about hearing those words from Hayden herself. She was no longer simply reacting to headlines. She was attempting to leave behind her own version of the story. Then came the loss of her brother Jansen. In 2023, Jansen died at just 28 years old, leaving Hayden to experience a grief that was almost impossible to separate from everything else she had already survived. Losing a sibling is devastating under any circumstances, but for Hayden it meant another piece of the family she had grown up with was suddenly gone. Her mother, Leslie Vogel, would later describe the enormous pain of losing both children within only a few years. Yet Hayden continued working and trying to move forward. She appeared in new projects, continued discussing her recovery, and attempted to rebuild a future that was not defined entirely by her past. People who knew her professionally remembered someone with enormous talent and an ability to bring emotion into a room almost instantly. But some of those closest to her also recognized that she was still struggling. Director Griff First, who worked with Hayden on one of her final films, later described her as someone fighting to maintain sobriety and said that he had been asked to help with a possible intervention. His comments added another painful layer to the story, but they also revealed something important. Hayden was still fighting. Then, on August 16, 2026, everything changed. Hayden was found unresponsive in Greenville, South Carolina. Emergency responders arrived and attempted to revive her, but she was pronounced dead at the scene. She was only 36 years old. An autopsy found no visible trauma, but her official cause and manner of death remained pending as investigators awaited additional testing, including toxicology. Almost immediately, the internet began searching for an explanation. Some reports focused on emergency dispatch references to a possible overdose. Other reports focused on medications found at the residence and the reported presence of Narcan. The Drug Enforcement Administration was also reported to have joined the investigation. But none of those details by themselves established what caused Hayden's death. Authorities had not announced a final cause, and her representative publicly warned people against turning rumors into conclusions, saying there was much more to the story than what was publicly known. Then Hayden's mother spoke. Leslie Vogel's grief was impossible to hide. She had already lost her son Jansen, and now she had lost her daughter. In an emotional television interview, she explained how difficult it was to process another devastating loss and pushed back against people judging Hayden without understanding what she had been going through. She wanted her daughter remembered for her intelligence, her humor, her beauty, and her spirit, not simply for the struggles that had followed her through adulthood. But Vogel also raised questions about Hayden's final hours. Her concerns centered particularly on the account surrounding Brian Hickerson, who was present with his brother when Hayden was found. Reports indicate that Hickerson's brother said Narcan was administered and that CPR was attempted before emergency responders arrived. At the same time, authorities have not announced that Hickerson caused Hayden's death, and investigators have reported no signs of foul play. Those facts are crucial because Hayden's history with Hickerson was complicated and included previous domestic violence cases. But suspicion is not proof. The investigation remains the investigation. And perhaps that is where Hayden's story should end. Not with an unproven theory, not with an internet rumor, and not with a headline trying to explain something that authorities themselves have not yet explained. It should end with the woman, the little girl who entered Hollywood before she was old enough to understand what fame meant. The teenager who became a television phenomenon. The actress who played characters capable of surviving almost anything. The young mother who suffered in silence before finding the courage to talk about postpartum depression. The woman who battled addiction and admitted that she needed help. The mother who made the agonizing decision to let her daughter live somewhere safer while she fought to recover. The sister who lost Jansen. And finally, the daughter who was still deeply loved by the people who knew her best. Hayden's life was not a simple tragedy. It was complicated, imperfect, painful, and at times incredibly beautiful. She made mistakes, but she also tried to repair them. She struggled, but she repeatedly reached for recovery. She lost people she loved, but she continued trying to create something better from what remained. And maybe the most heartbreaking part is that she had finally begun speaking about all of it herself. She wanted people to understand that the woman behind the headlines was still there. She wanted her daughter to know that she loved her. She wanted her experiences to mean something beyond the pain they caused. And she wanted to be remembered as more than what happened to her. Hayden Panettiere was 36 when her life ended, but the roles she played, the people she loved, and the conversations she started will continue long after the headlines disappear. Her daughter will grow older. One day, she will be old enough to understand the complicated story of her mother's life. And perhaps when she looks back, she will not see a perfect mother or an imperfect one. She will simply see a woman who loved her, a woman who struggled, a woman who tried, a woman who kept searching for her way back. And that may be the truth Hayden wanted the world to remember most. If this story touched you, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think Hayden Panettiere's legacy should be remembered for? Not the rumors surrounding her final days, but the life she lived before them.